Hello, and thank you very much for coming along today. Today we're going to consider July 5th, the day after Independence Day. What do we remember? In fact, as in all cases of celebrations, we wake up the day after and remember very strange and sometimes quite disturbing things, and other things are forgotten. But what do we remember the day after Independence Day? What do we choose to celebrate? Well, on a national level, our leaders are directing our attention to the national icons, Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt on Mount Rushmore. But what do we choose to forget in this process? If you remember some things, you relegate other things to less important status and forget them altogether. What about other people whose faces are carved in stone and in fact exist not far from where Mount Rushmore stands, even on a bigger scale? Further, how could a slaveholder write, "All men are created equal"? Yet this is what Jefferson wrote. And Washington was as well a slaveholder. And how could we forget what was said by Frederick Douglass on July 5th in 1852? What do we choose to celebrate or choose to forget the day after Independence Day? Well, in the spirit of reflection of the day after, let's take a brief look at the culture and institutions of the United States and how they have evolved since July 4th, 1776.
In the United States, there are professed values like democracy. In a democracy, public opinion is going to have some influence on policy. And then the government carries out actions determined by the population. That's what democracy means. It's important to understand that privileged and powerful sectors have never liked democracy, and for very good reasons. Democracy puts power into the hands of the general population and takes it away from them. Now, it's kind of a principle of concentration of wealth and power.
As Noam Chomsky has pointed out, the United States is based on principles, but not those principles publicly celebrated in the 4th of July speeches by our leaders.
Concentration of wealth yields concentration of power, particularly so as the cost of elections skyrockets, which kind of forces the political parties into the pockets of major corporations. And this political power quickly translates into legislation that increases the concentration of wealth. So fiscal policy like tax policy, deregulation, rules of corporate governance, and a whole variety of measures political measures designed to increase the concentration of wealth and power, which in turn yields more political power to do the same thing. And that's what we've been seeing. So we have this kind of vicious cycle in progress. You know, actually it is so traditional that it was described by Adam Smith in 1776. You read famous Wealth of Nations. He says in England, the principal architects of policy are the people who own the society, in his day merchants and manufacturers. And they make sure that their own interests are very well cared for, however grievous the impact on the people of England or others. Now, it's not merchants and manufacturers, it's financial institutions and multinational corporations. The people who Adam Smith called the masters of mankind. And they're following the vile maxim, all for ourselves and nothing for anyone else. They're just going to pursue policies that benefit them and harm everyone else. And in the absence of a general popular reaction, that's pretty much what you'd expect.
Noam Chomsky clearly spells out, one by one, the fundamental principles upon which American institutions have been based ever since 1776. Historically speaking, primary among these principles has been the principle designed to reduce democracy.
Right through American history, there's been an ongoing clash between pressure for more freedom and democracy coming from below and efforts at elite control and domination coming from above. It goes back to the founding of the country. James Madison, the main framer, who was as much of a believer in democracy as anybody in the world that day, nevertheless felt that the United States system should be designed, and indeed, with his initiative, was designed so that power should be in the hands of the wealthy, because the wealthy are the more responsible set of men. And therefore, the structure of the formal constitutional system placed most power in the hands of the Senate. Remember, the Senate was not elected in those days. It was selected from the wealthy. Men, as Madison put it, had sympathy for property owners and their rights. If you read the debates at the Constitutional Convention, Madison said the major concern of the society has to be to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And he had arguments. Suppose everyone had to vote freely. He said, well, the majority of the poor would get together and they would organize to take away the property of the rich. And he said that would obviously be unjust, so you can't have that. So therefore, the constitutional system has to be set up to prevent democracy. Which is of some interest that this debate has a hoary tradition, goes back to the first major book on political systems, Aristotle's Politics. He says of all of them, the best is democracy, but then he points out exactly the flaw that Madison pointed out. If Athens were a democracy for free men, the poor would get together and take away the property of the rich. Well, same dilemma, they had opposite solutions. Aristotle proposed what we would nowadays call a welfare state. He said, try to reduce inequality. So, same problem, opposite solutions. One is reduce inequality, you won't have this problem. The other is reduce democracy. If you look at the history of the United States, it's a constant struggle between these two tendencies. A democratizing tendency that's mostly coming from the population, a pressure from below, and you get this constant battle going on, periods of regression, periods of progress. The 1960s, for example, were a period of significant democratization. Sectors of the population that were usually passive and apathetic became organized, active, started pressing their demands. And they became more and more involved in decision-making, activism, and so on. It just changed consciousness in a lot of ways. Rights.
If democracy means freedom, why aren't our people free? Right. If democracy means justice, why don't we have justice? Right. If democracy means equality, why don't we have equality?
Women's rights.
This inhuman system of exploitation will change, but only if we force it to change, and force it together.
Concern for the environment.
A unique day in American history is ending, a day set aside for a nationwide outpouring of mankind seeking its own survival.
Opposition to aggression.
I'd say to those who criticize us for the militancy of our dissent that if they are serious about law and order, they should first provide it for the Vietnamese people, for our own black people, and for our own poor people.
Concern for other people.
One day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? When you begin to ask that question, you're raising a question about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth, the question of restructuring the whole of American society.
These are all civilizing effects. And that caused great fear.
Although Chomsky has clearly delineated the dynamic of the ongoing struggle between the democratic and authoritarian tendencies in America, he confesses that he underestimated the brutal power of the right-wing and the authoritarian reaction to achievements of the civil liberties and civil rights movements of the 1960s. What Chomsky clearly pointed out, but many Americans have not fully understood even yet, was that from the 1970s onward, there was a deliberate and orchestrated strategy of large corporate and financial institutions to promote a new public ideology of wealth, at the same time that these institutions reorganized the entire U.S. economy. The ideological component was to glorify wealth. The goal was to completely redesign the economy.
I hadn't anticipated the power of, I should have, but I didn't anticipate the power of the reaction to these civilizing effects of the 60s. I did not anticipate the strength of the reaction to it. The backlash. There has been an enormous, concentrated, coordinated business offensive beginning in the 70s to try to beat back the egalitarian efforts that went right through the Nixon years. You see it in many respects. I mean, over on the right, you see it in things like the famous Powell Memorandum sent to the Chamber of Commerce, the major business lobby, by later Supreme Court Justice Powell, warning them that business is losing control over the society. And something has to be done to counter these forces. Of course, he puts it in terms of defense, defending ourselves against outside power. But if you look at it, it's a call for business to use its control over resources to carry out a major offensive to beat back this democratizing wave. Over on the liberal side, there's something exactly similar. The first major report of the Trilateral Commission is concerned with this. It's called the Crisis of Democracy. Trilateral Commission is liberal internationalists. And their flavor is indicated by the fact that they pretty much staffed the Carter administration. They were also appalled by the democratizing tendencies of the 60s and thought we have to react to it. They were concerned that there was an excess of democracy developing. Previously passive and obedient parts of the population, what are sometimes called the special interests, were beginning to organize and try to enter the political arena. And they said that imposes too much pressure on the state. It can't deal with all these pressures. So therefore they have to return to passivity and become depoliticized. They were particularly concerned with what was happening to young people. The young people are getting too free and independent.
None of us will begin any violence. If there's any violence, it will be because of the police.
The way they put it, there's a failure on the part of the schools, the universities, and churches, the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. Their phrase, not mine. If you look at their study, there's one interest they never mention: private business. And that makes sense. They're not special interests. They're the national interest, kind of by definition. So they're okay. They're allowed to, have lobbyists buy campaigns, staff the executive, make decisions. That's fine. But it's the rest, the special interests, the general population, who have to be subdued. Well, that's the spectrum. It's the kind of ideological level of the backlash. Since the 1970s, there's been a concerted effort on the part of the masters of mankind, the owners of the society, to shift the economy in two crucial respects. One, to increase the role of financial institutions, banks, investment firms, and so on, insurance companies. By 2007, right before the latest crash, they had literally 40% of corporate profits, far beyond anything in the past. Back in the 1950s, as for many years before, the United States economy was based largely on production. The United States was the great manufacturing center of the world. Financial institutions used to be a relatively small part of the economy, and their task was to distribute unused assets, like, say, bank savings, to productive activity.
The bank always has on hand a reserve of money received from the stockholders and depositors. On the basis of these cash reserves, a bank can create credit. So besides providing a safe place for depositing money, a bank serves a community by making additional credit available for many purposes. For a manufacturer to meet his payroll during slack selling period, for a merchant to enlarge and remodel his store, and for many other good reasons why people are always needing more credit than they have immediately available.
That's a contribution to the economy. Regulatory system was established. Banks were regulated. The commercial and investment banks were separated, cut back very risky investment practices that could harm private people. There had been, remember, no financial crashes during the period of regulation. By the 1970s, that changed. started getting the huge increase in the flows of speculative capital, just astronomically increased. Enormous changes in the financial sector, from traditional banks to risky investments, complex financial instruments, money manipulations, and so on. Increasingly, the business of the country isn't production, at least not here. The primary business here is business. You can even see it in the choice of directors. So a director of a major American corporation back in the 50s and the 60s was very likely to be an engineer, somebody who graduated from a place like MIT, maybe industrial management. More recently, the directorship and the top managerial positions are people who came out of business schools, learned financial trickery of various kinds, and so on. By the 1970s, say General Electric could make more profit playing games with money than you could by producing in the United States. You have to remember that General Electric is substantially a financial institution today. It makes half its profits just by moving money around in complicated ways. And it's very unclear that they're doing anything that's of value to the economy. So that's one phenomenon, what's called financialization of the economy. Going along with that is the offshoring of production. The trade system was reconstructed with a very explicit design of putting working people in competition with one another all over the world. And what it's led to is a reduction in the share of income on the part of working people. It's been particularly striking in the United States, but it's happening worldwide. It means that an American worker is in competition with a super exploited worker in China. Meanwhile, highly paid professionals are protected. They're not placed in competition with the rest of the world, far from it. And of course, capital is free to move. Workers aren't free to move. Labor can't move, but capital can. Well, again, going back to the classics like Adam Smith, as he pointed out, free circulation of labor is the foundation of any free trade system. But workers are pretty much stuck. The wealthy and the privileged are protected, so you get obvious consequences, and they're recognized, and in fact praised. Policy is designed to increase insecurity. Alan Greenspan, when he testified to Congress, he explained his success in running the economy as based on what he called greater worker insecurity.
Atypical restraint on compensation increases has been evident for a few years now. But as I outlined in some detail in testimony last month, I believe that job insecurity has played the dominant role.
Keep workers insecure, they're going to be under control. They are not going to ask for, say, decent wages or decent working conditions or the opportunity of free association, meaning unionize. Now, for the masters of mankind, that's fine. They make their profits. But for the population, it's devastating. Well, these two processes, financialization and offshoring, are part of what led to the vicious cycle of concentration of wealth, concentration of power.
The analysis by Chomsky and others who examine American history has underscored that the United States is caught in the grips of a vicious cycle of wealth and power. It is this vicious cycle of wealth and power that he delineated in a whole series of analytical principles, leading to the extraordinary concentration of wealth and power in current-day America. It is this vicious cycle of wealth and power that provides the basis for our current circumstance on the 4th of July. Let's take a look.
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are. Teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976 they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money, but do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
Wealth inequality in America is really quite pronounced, and we really have to wake up and look at the difference between the ideal and what we actually think is happening and what in reality is happening. This is the kind of reality that is not available to people who live in alternate universes. The reality in this country is not what we think it is, according to the analysis of the economists. Trump has gone on to compare himself with Lincoln and questions the motives of protesters who indicate that he's nowhere near Lincoln in his stature. Yet he tries to present himself with a backdrop of Mount Rushmore, suggesting that he too should be chiseled into stone in memory of all he's accomplished. Yet he uses racist language in order to stir up the most divisive forms of conflict in this country. It's interesting to look at Mount Rushmore in its historical context, how it got built and how it was really totally outscaled by the same memorial of a statue head created for Crazy Horse just a few miles away. It's interesting to look at this through the vantage point of veteran journalists who grew up in the area. Tom Brokaw is commenting on the hilarity of the analogy that Trump is trying to create. Let's look.
And joining us now, NBC News senior correspondent Tom Brokaw, who hails from Yankton, South Dakota, and has a lifelong deep knowledge of this issue as it affects Native Americans. Tom, it's great to see you. Talk to me about Mount Rushmore and how it is viewed very differently, as Cal just reports, by the indigenous peoples.
I've lived with it my entire life, really. My family was on an army base not too far away from there during World War II, and we would go and have picnics at the base of Mount Rushmore when there was no infrastructure whatsoever. But it is very important for everyone to understand the role of the Lakota and Dakota people and their legitimate claim on the Black Hills. In 1860, they were granted the Black Hills, and then Custer, as was his wont, came riding into the Black Hills, set off a gold rush, and then they broke the treaty. No question about that. And in 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that it was a violation of the treaty and granted the tribes an enormous amount of money, but it was not enough. That was not the money that they were interested in. There is a fund now that's over $1 billion because the tribes don't want to go into that money. They want their land back. It's not likely to happen, obviously, but I think it's an important part of our culture and our history that they are there and reminding everyone this was their land at the beginning.
Let's talk about Crazy Horse and the memorial that is there and the importance of that figure to the Lakota and Dakota.
Well, it was called Pahasapa, the Black Hills. Very rich part of the world. A lot of wildlife, beautiful conifers that exist there as well. I grew up effectively in one form or another in the Black Hills as a Boy Scout, camping across it, living there during World War II, going back very often in the course of my life. I've never failed to be thrilled and moved by the importance of the Black Hills to the native culture, but also to the people who came later to South Dakota. And then you have to remember, that's Crazy Horse. This is a private enterprise created so that they could pay tribute to the great warrior chiefs of the Lakota tribe. That's not too far away. That's all private money. Korczak Zukowski did that. He was a Polish sculptor. His family now runs it as a commercial enterprise. And it's very important for us not to overlook that, because those people whose land we effectively invaded made a great, strong warrior stand to retain it. He was killed by an American soldier, and he's been buried on the prairie by his people, and no one knows where. So it's one of the great American historic stories.
Equally worthy of attention is the way in which we, as Americans, have simply overlooked the most glaring contradictions of the history of the 4th of July. Simple question: how could a slaveholder write, "All men are created equal," and declare it in a document to the world? Well, this is something that American historians and professors of law have been looking into in great detail. Also troubling, why don't we hear more about Frederick Douglass's speech of the 5th of July, 1852. It's an extraordinary speech and has now been presented across the country from the original documents. Yale University recently webcast this series of documents in live readings on air to be shared through YouTube. Citizens have gotten together as well. State Representative Marjorie in Cambridge, Massachusetts, held an online town hall meeting where citizens from Cambridge read from the documents as well. Well, the 5th of July, the day after Independence Day, is something that should be a pause for all of us, where we can ask, what do we remember? What do we choose to celebrate? And what icons are available in public space? And what do we choose to forget? On a massive scale, our history is full of forgetfulness, and we haven't answered some basic questions. What do we choose to forget?
Today, in this special broadcast, we begin with the words of Frederick Douglass. Born into slavery around 1818, Douglass became a key leader of the abolitionist movement. On July 5, 1852, in Rochester, New York, Douglass gave one of his most famous speeches, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. He was addressing the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. This is James Earl Jones reading the historic address during a performance of Voices of a People's History of the United States. That's edited by Howard Zinn. The late great historian introduced the address.
Frederick Douglass, once a slave, became a brilliant and powerful leader of the anti-slavery movement. In 1852, he was asked to speak in celebration of the 4th of July.
Fellow citizens, pardon me, and allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty, an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes that would disgrace a nation of savages. There's not a nation of the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument, is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour forth a stream, a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and the crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced.